Okay.
Bob Murphy, it's a pleasure to have you, and thank you for doing such great work in editing Illusions of Wealth.
Well, thanks. It's good to be here. And yeah, it was fun to work on. And it's every time I go back and read stuff from Mises, I get more out of it. And it seems like he's stressing something that I never even noticed before.
I'm glad to hear you say that because I had a weird experience reading through the book. My first thought was, well, I don't really need to read this. I'd read it like 10 other times, right?
Right.
And then I found a completely new take on things. And I laid it out in an article, which I don't know if you agreed with or not, but what would you say is the most overlooked insight that Mises has in this book?
Well, I mean, I hesitate to say that just because I'm sure I'll say something, then someone else will come along and bring something else, and I'll say, "Oh yeah, that was more overlooked." And I feel funny saying this because it's not like it's a new thing, but going this time through it, I see how much economic calculation just pervaded everything. In other words, we all knew it was important for his critique of socialism and how markets work. But I mean, he was talking about that early in the book. Just like as the foundation of Western civilization. You got the sense that he thought that you couldn't do arithmetic if you didn't already have the notion of economic calculation. And I'm not really putting words in his mouth. He almost comes out and says something that powerful, and you're reading him and you believe him. You're like, yeah, you're right. Without needing to keep track of your flocks or something, why would you bother developing numbers? And it's really you see why he stressed that so much and why it wasn't just some little thing to argue with socialists about, that it was really central.
Yeah, and in fact, yeah, I know what you mean. The extent to which he emphasizes that point is shocking just because you rarely hear about it otherwise. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing analogous to that in mainstream economics. I mean, if you explained what it was, I'm sure a mainstream economist would be like, "Oh yeah, we know that stuff's important. You got it." But I mean, there's no role for accountants in mainstream economic models. Like you don't even think of that. There's not even entrepreneurs, let alone would there be accountants. And yet, when you read that, in Mises quotes the Goethe thing saying that one of the greatest inventions of the human mind was double entry bookkeeping, and some outsider hearing that would probably laugh and say, "Oh, you economists with your you bean counters." But that's kind of a powerful statement to say double entry bookkeeping is one of the most important inventions of the human mind. And that really just again summarizes what Mises meant. And he wasn't being flippant; he was being serious with that stuff. So
Yeah, it's almost like he thinks that, like, if you eliminated economic calculation, like the lights would be shut out on the world. It's like it would be a dark and dismal and chaotic world.
yeah, who's the man behind the curtain there? I guess we should
That's
pay no attention.
yeah, that is Stefan Kinsella. He has fixed my lighting problem, right? Yeah. But anyway, yeah, no, I mean it's so extreme his and yet it kind of persuades you of it in a way. I mean, and so you have to understand calculation in order to understand the business cycle. Why?
Well, because sort of like Hayek said, in order to understand how things could go wrong, we need to understand how they could ever be right. And just to walk through and see that, oh yeah, in a modern economy, it's again we take it for granted. There's not just this capital stock, capital K, the way there is in a mainstream model. That to say, oh yeah, we made a bunch of savings and investments this year. There has to be definite capital goods that are produced, and they need to be complementary in some respect. Like if you just made a bunch of screws and no screwdrivers, well, that would be pretty useless. And if you just made a bunch of hammers but no nails, that would be useless. And so it's when we're talking about why are some nations richer than others, and some people say, oh, because they have more capital. It's not just capital. It has to be a certain way, and like just the complexity of the problem is mind-boggling when you start thinking about it. And so that's and all that kind of complexity, you don't get that anywhere else except in Austrian economics. I mean, maybe some other kinds of, heterodox schools of thought. I know, there were critiques of the mainstream position on capital interest theory, not just coming from the Austrians, but I still think the Austrians really are the ones who zeroed in on that. And so that's why, in other words, you couldn't even say the Austrian theory of the business cycle to a mainstream economist. I remember in grad school one time, I tried to give the elevator pitch of it to my buddy, and he said, "Oh, so it's a theory of overinvestment." And as we
Yeah.
know, no, that's not quite right. Mises stressed it's malinvestment. So it's not just
Yeah.
that, if it were just overinvestment, that would mean, oh, we restricted consumption too much today in order to have more 10 years from now, and that was suboptimal relative to our preferences. But you wouldn't be able to have a boom and then a bust the way you can get, when there's genuine discoordination in the capital structure.
Yeah, yeah, it's the discoordination that jumps out to me in the whole section on the business cycle. Like that's the main thing. That's the main theme is the appearance of imbalances. That surprised me, I guess, a little bit because maybe I would have expected there to be more emphasis on, inflation and that sort of stuff. But it seems like Mises was really focused on this problem of capital depletion, and
Yeah.
discoordination.
Yeah, and yeah, a thing that struck me going through it again this time too is this notion of capital consumption, and I think that's a crucial point that a lot of superficial critics of the Austrian
Right.
theory miss because they say, wait a minute, you guys are stressing that there's too much investment going on because interest rates are artificially low.
Right.
Then how can it be that we're living it up during the boom? How can there be this false prosperity? Shouldn't we all be poor because we're saving too much, or so, or because too many resources are getting diverted into capital goods and not enough into consumption? But that he explains that by saying, well, actually we're unwittingly consuming our capital. So if it were like a farm analogy, if the farmer and his family were literally eating the seed corn, but they didn't realize they were,
Right.
they actually could be eating more while they're expanding their farmland and trying to till more soil because they're just wrong. They're thinking they're going to be richer next year, and then they realize to their shock, oh my gosh, we ate half the seed corn. We didn't even realize we were doing that.
That Mises actually gives some examples, doesn't he? He even talks about how people spend have exaggerated and spend it on entertainment and vacations and build ever larger houses. I think he has a passing comment about how people build larger houses.
Right.
And sort of just generally squander more of their personal resources, anticipating, a future that's bright and beautiful.
Yeah, and you're right. Just to go back to something you said earlier. There is the Misesian theory of the business cycle. He called it the circulation credit theory of the trade cycle. Now we just call it Austrian business cycle theory.
Yeah.
It's not about price inflation.
Right.
The only way that comes into play. Well, there's two respects. One is that when he's trying to explain typically what happens, what makes the banks chicken out and eventually stop engaging in credit expansion is just prices start rising and people get nervous. And then the other thing is he's saying if for some reason they just threw caution to the winds and kept pumping in more money to the credit market, he said eventually the currency would collapse, and that's the ultimate check on it. But the fact that there's an unsustainable boom that leads to a necessary bust. The problem there is real imbalances. It's not that, oh, gee, prices are going to rise too fast and that's bad, so that's why we shouldn't do this.
That's right.
It's
Also, he talks a little bit about. You're satisfied.
I have Yoda here.
Yeah,
on my back.
that's fine. Another thing that intrigued me was his comment about overinvestment in technology.
Mm-hmm.
That you kind of like. He imagines that there's a ton of ideas out there, a ton of technology that would, could potentially come online that is not used. And so then when you lower interest rates and create a false boom, that technology is sort of pulled from the warehouse sort of faster than it otherwise would be. And
Right.
yet there's the capital depletion that takes place. And so you get kind of like hyper improvements, hyper progress taking place in due to technological advance, but without that sort of capital foundation. And when he was talking about this, I thought, my God, that sounds exactly like now.
Right.
Yeah,
and that's something I know. Bumbaver stressed this. I don't remember if Menger did. I can't remember reading it in Menger, but maybe I just missed it. But yeah, that's something they stress that at any given time there are all sorts of technological recipes that would be more productive in terms of physical output relative to physical inputs. It's just the time of waiting, the period of production is too long given time preferences.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that happens when the interest rate drops. if it drops because of genuine savings, then in other words, that's how it's physically possible that we do raise our standard of living by abstaining from present consumption and putting it aside for the future, is because now we can take advantage of these recipes. Just that if when Robinson Crusoe gets dumped on the tropical island, the thing holding him back is not his technological know-how.
Right.
If you visit him 10 years after he lands on the island, the reason he's wealthier then and has a higher standard of living is not because he discovered some stuff. It's because it took him time to put into practice what he already knew from having grown up in civilization. And so the same thing with society as a whole. There's all kinds of stuff we could do if we just had more capital goods available. We just don't, and that's why saving is such a good thing. So you're right. If the interest rate becomes artificially low, at least in the beginning, it has the same sort of appearance. It looks like now we're able to take advantage of all these things that are more physically productive. We just needed a lower interest rate to implement them. The problem is you get halfway through the process and then you run out of real savings because the whole thing was based on...
Well, and I wondered if another consequence of this is that whether society becomes, like, in a weird sense, like, too dependent on technology. Like, in order for the economy to grow, there has to be, like, unrelenting technological increases because, like, you can't ever rest. Like, if you rest, then you go into recession, start going backwards because there's no capital foundation there. So you get kind of it's like a person who has to kind of keep getting stronger just so they can walk,
Right.
And the minute you stop going to the gym, like, you become an invalid, And I wondered if it was that sort of way, and if we have become, in a way, kind of overly dependent on this skewed imbalance between capital formation and technological progress.
Yeah, well, the way I come at it, I think we're saying similar things, but the way I was thinking of it is, during the 1920s, there were a lot of legitimate improvements.
Right.
Like the U.S. economy in particular. I mean, there are also electrification and more people using radios and things like this. So there are many respects in which the standard of living in the United States really did rise, and you can point to all sorts of policy changes. Like they brought the federal income tax way down. Calvin Coolidge ran very tight fiscal budgets throughout his whole administration and so forth. So there's various reasons, except we know what the Fed was doing, and yet it fooled people because CPI was fairly flat, and we all know famously that Mises and Hyde pointed out that just the stability of the CPI isn't proof that things are good. And I think it's the same thing with us, and that's kind of what there really were all sorts of improvements in international trade and capital flows and things like that. So it's just, had we had hard money from 97 onward, I think we would have seen an incredible improvement in standards of living around the world, and there wouldn't have been a huge collapse.
Right.
So it's unfortunate, and maybe I think partly those legitimate technological improvements, the internet and all that stuff, helped to mask. In other words, everyone could see the stock market booming, but I think a lot of people were saying, well, maybe that's because of the internet and all that stuff, and so it made people more complacent. And I think the same thing happened in the 20s when the stock market took off. I think a lot of them were like, well, gee, look at, there's more washing machines being used. I mean, come on. Of course we should have a boom.
Did that really happen? That's interesting.
Well, I mean, I don't know that anyone said that particular sentence.
No, but
certainly, there were lots of, improvements in the average standard of living of U.S. households in the 20s.
So that's very interesting. That's very similar to now, and it's in a way. I mean, but you're right. I mean, the level of technological advance that we've seen, had it been supported by genuine capital with a great capital foundation and sort of free markets, I mean, God knows where we would be today, right? I mean, we've experienced astonishing levels of growth.
Yeah, I mean, because it's true. I mean, what the changes in China and India and there's all kinds of free trade agreements that they're making and so forth over there. There's many respects in which the world became a lot freer politically and then economically over the last 20 years, let's say, just freeing up billions of people. So I don't know how you want to quantify it, but there's a genuine sense in which you might argue the world as a whole got economically freer over the last few decades. And so you're right. I mean, just because it's the kind of thing where it's not just linear, that when you free up a billion people, just if one guy has a great idea, everyone can copy it.
Right.
So when you free up a billion people who before were living in huts, I'm exaggerating obviously, but you get the point. So it's exponential increases that could have been possible, and it's just unfortunate that now that's all being. Oh yeah, we tried deregulation, and look what happened.
Yeah. Tell me this: when you were reading Mises this time around, and I'm sure you go through this yourself, do you ever try to like? I know you find it compelling. I certainly did, and I felt like I, had Mises right in front of me, like giving me a new lesson. To reteach me something I thought I knew but probably didn't. Do you ever read sections that he's written on the business cycle? And this is clearly his most elaborate presentation of it, right? Do you ever read it from the point of view of, a mainstream economist having encountered this way of thinking for the first time and wonder whether or not it would be convincing to somebody who had never encountered it before?
Yeah, sort of. I think, like I say, it's tricky. It would be tricky for them to even get in that mindset because their theory of the capital structure is so much simpler.
Yeah.
I would say cruder
Right.
than the Austrian version. And so, like, if they're trying to translate it into the solo growth model or something,
Yeah.
it almost can't be done. You
Right.
can't have an unsustainable boom in that kind of a model because it's just, well, this is how much capital there is. And you mix it with labor and you get this much output.
Right.
It wouldn't make sense to say, oh, we didn't have the right types of capital and they don't mesh together properly.
Right.
And then, I mean, because the other thing, too, is they don't really appreciate the way that market prices guide behavior. And that's something that Hayek stressed more than Mises, but of course it's implicit in Mises.
Yeah.
And so if you don't really get how market prices give a feedback mechanism and guide people, it's hard to see how if the interest rate's wrong, that's going to screw everything up.
Actually, Mises has a section in here and where he says if all the memory of market prices were wiped out, like if we had no memory, whatever. Remember that section? He says this that it would take us a while to kind of get back on board, but we could eventually sort of reconstruct things, but it would be tricky,
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I thought it was a very funny sentence. That whole section on calculation was amazing.
Well, I think what he was doing there, if we're thinking of the same section,
Yeah.
he was trying to show, it had to do with the regression theorem. So he was trying to show the sense in which to know how much, like to know relative prices, just as relies on marginal utility and things like that. So we could pretty quickly figure out again how much, a ton of steel should be worth relative to cows.
Right.
But to figure out what's the purchasing power of a dollar bill, if you lost all memory of prices, there's no way we could get that back because you need that historical component. I think that's what he was talking about.
That was a section on money. Tell me this. I kind of when I started after I read the book, I started looking at savings rates and looking at there's no way to really measure the thing that Mises calls capital depletion, right? I mean, there's no single aggregate that captures that. But I was looking at something like gross savings and sort of doping around, have fun with Fred's statistics, right, to try to figure out things. And I kind of threw together looking at federal funds rates over the last 30 years, and we see this like dramatic decline, which I just took as being evidence that that's what the Federal Reserve has accomplished or made possible or made a part of its policy. But almost as soon as I posted that, I had people writing me saying that the zero interest rates and the shape of the yield curve that we're experiencing now and the sort of long run decline and sort of constant pressure down on interest rates despite the absence of capital accumulation, that is not Fed policy. That has something to do with something else. It's not, the Fed is only following the market. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, to the extent that they got price inflation relatively under control, like as compared with the 70s, I do agree. In other words, so partly why nominal interest rates are lower from 1990 onward compared to 1970 through 1985, let's say, is because the public was less worried about large rises in the price level, and so they were willing to lend money out at lower nominal rates because they weren't building in as much of a what people call an inflation component or premium. But I don't. I understand the claim, but I mean, it's you can see, like for example, when Greenspan was in office and the dot-com crash happened, and the Fed funds rate went from 6.5% down to 1%, and then it started rising again. I mean, I've plotted that against changes in the monetary base, and the pattern looks like it should. In other words, the money growth went way up when the interest rate got pushed down, and then the money growth tapered off when the interest rate started rising. And so it's. I think they had a lot. They do control. So yeah, they can't ultimately it's set by the market, but certainly if you can adjust the quantity of money, you have a pretty big influence on that, especially if you're buying short-term treasuries.
Right.
I think they do have a lot of power in manipulating.
And what about the fact that the Fed is now, I guess more recently, buying all over the yield curve, right? I mean, isn't it buying, 10 to 30-year bonds, and isn't that what it does now? I mean,
right, yeah. So like with Operation Twist,
yeah.
we're trying to remain neutral, and they just kept doing it, and saying, okay, now on net we're going to start accumulating. Right. So the theory behind what they're doing is to try to suppress it, not just the short term, but to push down the longer term ones. In theory, they should have less power to do that because you would think the price inflation would kick in eventually. So in other words, it'd be harder for them to hold down 20 and 30-year yields because that would just get offset by the expectations of nominal price rises. But I mean, I think they can do it. I mean, there's a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If everyone expects the Fed's going to be there and willing to print up money and give it to you for a bond.
But you were, if you want to just continue exactly where we cut off, you're talking about, the Fed's intervention and the yield curve.
Yeah, right. So, I mean, the way just mainstream people would model it, and I kind of think it's right, is that the Fed, in theory, can control short-term rates more than long-term. If they want to buy 3-month treasuries, that's pretty set in stone. But if they have to inflate, and put more money in the economy in order to do that, they can't control long-term price hikes, and so that just sort of gets built in. So it's harder for them to control 30-year yields. That's the idea. But I mean, even there is some leeway, and if people think that the Fed's going to be buying treasuries, for the next 50 years or whatever, if that's what the new policy is, I think they do have some leeway. Like if the Fed just announced forevermore we're going to stop buying treasuries and we're going to switch to buying bonds issued by General Motors, I think that would affect things. I don't think we just say, rational expectations, that won't have any impact on the real allocation of resources. General Motors would certainly like that, and the Treasury would certainly be mad.
Right.
So I think it's sometimes people are a little bit too flippant when they make it sound like the Fed literally is powerless.
Yeah.
Or mortgage-backed securities. It certainly helps the people who own mortgage-backed securities that the Fed's buying their stuff and not somebody else's stuff.
One final question about the Fed's influence over this, because it's crucial to Mises' theory, right? What effect does the moral hazard have on the rate of interest? I mean, if you've got the Fed basically promising to bail out the entire financial system and having shown that it's willing to do that, doesn't that remove all the default risk premium from rates and cause them to be lower than they otherwise would be?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think you're right that it certainly lowers the yields on the particular types of assets that the Fed is going to be the buyer of last resort for. And so, yeah, people don't need to worry about the Treasury literally defaulting, and that's what all these people say. Hey, we issue our own currency, we can't possibly default. It's impossible. And then the same thing with mortgage-backed securities, so long as people think that that's a favored asset class, those yields are going to be lower than they otherwise would be. So I think you're definitely right. And just more generally, yeah, financial sector assets that are tied to so-called too-big-to-fail institutions, by the same token, yeah, you think people would take that into consideration that, well, they're not going to let this thing go down.
Well, you look at the interest rates on things like P2P lending or on credit cards, or if I go down to a local private lender and borrow some money to put up some new drapes or whatever. I mean, this stuff is running, depending on your credit score, between 7 and 15%.
Yeah, right. And this goes back something to like in the canonical exposition of Austrian business cycle theory, we talk about the interest rate. But now, just you and I talking have pointed out, well, gee, there's different maturities. So even we're just talking treasuries. You say, what's the yield on treasuries? You got to be more. So what do you mean? 3 months, 6 months, 20-year? What do you mean? And then there's also different types of bonds and other types. So you're right. There's no such thing as the interest rate. And the Fed might be able to suppress some interest rates, but I think you're right. That just ends up making other ones be higher than they otherwise would be.
Yeah, it's almost like we have a parallel economies, parallel interest rate economies working. You've got like the official yield curve, and then you've got everything else. Well, listen, I've taken up enough of your time. Thank you again for enlightening me, because it really helped me to revisit this work that I thought I knew, and then almost felt like I was experiencing for the first time going through it. So,
well, thanks for having me. If we could just explain it, for the listeners who don't know what it is. I mean, it's what we did is we went through human action and grabbed what you needed to understand the business cycle.
right.
So there's a lot of stuff in there that's not just pure business cycles. You need to have that. You need to know what he thinks about money, about interest, and so forth to understand the business cycle theory. But the point was, what from human action do you need in order to really get Mises' business cycle theory? And that's what we're trying to give in this new volume.
Yeah, and I feel like, as I say, I feel like I've read this, relentlessly for 25 years, and yet I feel like it was the first time. I don't know if that's just me, but I don't know. I probably feel the same way. People need to spend more time actually reading the original words of Mises.
Right. Well, I think I know what it is that you and I, having gone through this crisis, I mean, before, you and I never went through something like the Depression when we were reading it, so it wasn't real for us. Just like, before I got into the financial sector and when I left academia and started dealing with derivatives and things, and then I went back to write the study guide for Theory of Money and Credit, and I couldn't believe how smart Mises has gotten. Because he, of course, when I had read that book earlier, I didn't even know what he was talking about. I didn't really know what a futures market was when I first read that, and so then when I did know that stuff and read it, it was like, oh my gosh, he knows all this stuff too. And same thing here. I think, you and I, having gone through an actual unsustainable boom and a huge crash, now a lot of stuff Mises said that before we didn't even know he was talking about.
Yeah, maybe that's it. But it was like fresh. He might as well have written it yesterday. Like I'd never seen it before. It was shocking because I got to tell you, I was dreading the project, right? I mean, and then it was just, oh my God, look what I've learned. So thank you again, and thanks for taking. I know you're very busy today. Thank you so much, Professor Murphy. We'll be in touch.
Okay, sure thing, Jeff.
Okay,
Talk to you
bye-bye.
later.